This herd of cattle was Lion Tete's retirement plan. Throughout his working life, he contributed regularly to increase the herd, hoping that when he retired, it would become a viable business. But despite all his efforts, trade with his cattle is still severely restricted. In southern Africa, hundreds of thousands of cattle owners, like Lion Tete, live in or close to wildlife conservation areas. Their cattle are their biggest asset, but the majority of these farmers cannot access lucrative markets for their cattle or the beef they produce. For more than 90 years, many of southern Africa's cattle farmers have been kept in virtual trade lockdown because of foot-and-mouth disease. So what is foot-and-mouth disease?
Examine it. It has nothing on the lower gums.
Foot-and-mouth disease is a contagious viral disease of cloven-hoofed animals, such as cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, as well as wild ruminants like buffalo or impala.
On the dental pad, this is where we also check on the dental pad if it has something, because the lesions develop on the tongue and all parts of the mouth. But thus far, it has no other lesions in the mouth. So we now go to the feet.
Foot-and-mouth disease virus sometimes, not always, causes sores in the mouth and at the skin-hoof junction of the feet, and also on the teats of cows.
So you can see it's not normal. Normal skin is nice and rigid. This is papery, it's already dead.
Those sores may result in drooling and lameness, and sometimes pregnant animals abort. Foot-and-mouth disease is not a lethal disease. Few animals actually die of foot-and-mouth disease. Very young animals can sometimes die suddenly because of acute heart failure.
This is all the things that are making it to salivate that much.
Humans cannot get foot-and-mouth disease. Nevertheless, foot-and-mouth disease ranks as perhaps the most economically important infectious disease of animals. It has, at some time, affected most parts of the world. In the developed world, where it has been eradicated, foot-and-mouth disease has the reputation of being a disaster wherever and whenever it occurs. It is remembered as a disease that bankrupted many farmers, because outside Africa, it is usually a far more serious disease, especially in intensive farming systems. Europe, North America, and other free areas therefore do their utmost to prevent reintroduction of the infection. That is the basis of trade bans and other sanitary measures applied to developing regions of the world where foot-and-mouth disease is still endemic. Most cattle producers in southern Africa do not understand the hysteria about foot-and-mouth disease at all. Their forefathers lived with the disease for generations. The foot-and-mouth disease they know is a mild disease that rarely kills cattle. Almost all cattle in southern Africa recover completely in a week or two, and hardly ever suffer long-lasting effects. Farmers like Lion Tete are far more concerned about lethal diseases like tick-borne infections that seem to be accepted as the norm by animal health authorities, because they do not affect trade. These farmers see the harsh control measures applied to foot-and-mouth disease control as an inexplicable burden. So the direct costs of foot-and-mouth disease in southern Africa are minimal, because the disease itself is essentially trivial. However, the indirect costs resulting from trade disruption and embargoes are far more serious. Indirect costs are not only financial, but the environmental and sociological costs are difficult to quantify. The cost of construction and maintenance of disease control fences put in place to separate wildlife especially buffalo, from livestock is increasingly unaffordable. There are also costly routine control measures, such as prophylactic vaccination programs, as well as elimination of foot and mouth disease outbreaks when they occur. And caught up in this foot and mouth disease controlled environment are hundreds of thousands of rural farmers like Lion Tete, who cannot escape poverty and subsistence farming. There are two distinct branches of the foot and mouth disease virus genus: the SAT types, the Southern African Territories viruses, and the Eurasian types. The form of foot and mouth disease that occurs in Southern Africa, known as SAT type, is different from foot and mouth disease that occurs in most other parts of the world. The SAT lineage viruses, identified as SAT1, 2, and 3, evolved in association with African buffalo and are maintained mainly by African buffalo populations. They are thought to have been the primordial foot and mouth disease viruses and have possibly been present in southern Africa for nearly 1,000 years. The African buffalo is the only wildlife species known to naturally harbor foot and mouth disease viruses. They can carry them, but do not get sick from them, and also show no signs of foot and mouth disease. However, if they come into contact with farm animals like cattle and sheep, and also other cloven-hoofed wild animals, they can sometimes, but not always, pass on the virus. The interaction between SAT-type foot and mouth disease and wildlife, buffalo in particular, is unique and also crucial because the viruses survive indefinitely in wildlife populations, independently of livestock. For that and other reasons, we cannot eradicate SAT-type viruses from southern Africa because the mass destruction of buffalo is clearly not an option. The Eurasian lineage of foot and mouth disease viruses, the O, A, C, and Asia 1, probably derived originally from the SATs, but evolved in Europe and Asia in association with cattle, pigs, and sheep, and possibly first occurred in domestic livestock in the Mediterranean basin some 400 to 500 years ago. The Eurasian types behave differently in some important respects from the SAT types. The crucial point is that the Eurasian types are inherently infections of livestock, unlike the SATs. Although they can infect cloven-hoofed wildlife, they cannot survive for long in wildlife populations, including African buffalo, unless the infection is regularly reintroduced by livestock. So, if this type of foot and mouth disease is managed effectively in livestock, the viruses disappear from wildlife. Eurasian type foot and mouth disease is therefore easier to control and was eliminated from North America before vaccines became available. Here in southern Africa, foot and mouth disease is maintained by wildlife, and that makes the control of the disease far more difficult than elsewhere in the world. The major differences between SAT and Eurasian serotypes of foot and mouth disease virus and their effects. SAT foot and mouth disease evolved in and is maintained in buffalo, while Eurasian foot and mouth disease evolved in and is maintained in livestock. The SAT viruses cause slow, inefficient spread, but the Eurasian types cause rapid, efficient spread. SAT types cause mild disease with apparent low morbidity. The Eurasian types cause apparent high morbidity. With SAT foot and mouth disease, carrier buffaloes exist, but no wild carrier ruminants with Eurasian foot and mouth disease. The antigenic diversity of SAT viruses complicates vaccination, while Eurasian viruses have less antigenic diversity. Unfortunately, internationally, foot-and-mouth disease is usually viewed as a single disease that behaves the same the world over. This is reflected in set trade standards and control measures recommended by international animal health agencies and trading blocs. Governments in this part of the world have spent millions trying to comply with these international standards based on geographical zoning that are not entirely appropriate for SAT-type foot-and-mouth disease. The key features of the two lineages of foot-and-mouth disease reveal why they require different management strategies. In southern African rangelands, the spread of infection caused by SAT-type viruses in cattle populations is usually slow and inefficient, with the number of secondary cases generated by a single infected animal in a fully susceptible population only barely above 1. Eurasian-type foot-and-mouth disease, on the other hand, is notorious for its ability to spread rapidly over long distances, even without the transportation of infected animals. Therefore, it is a highly contagious infection, with one animal able to infect 10 or more others. Unlike the situation in northern Europe, airborne spread of foot-and-mouth disease over distances of 10 kilometers or more does not occur in tropical or subtropical regions. This is related not only to climate, but also the species of animals involved, as well as stocking density. Pigs, unlike ruminants, usually become infected by eating foot-and-mouth disease virus-contaminated swill. In other parts of the world, pigs are important in the maintenance of foot-and-mouth disease. In southern Africa, pigs have rarely been involved in outbreaks caused by SAT viruses. Furthermore, SAT serotypes commonly cause mild disease as well as subclinical infection, so the number of cattle that actually become sick is usually less than 5%, and often below 1%, even lower in sheep and goats. In this foot-and-mouth disease outbreak close to Kruger National Park, only a small percentage of the large herd presented visible signs of foot-and-mouth disease. A few calves had difficulty in walking. Some animals showed healing lesions, while a small group showed visible lesions on the gums and tongue. Cattle that present lesions can sometimes be identified by visible drooling. It is nevertheless clear that the majority of the herd did not develop the disease. The role of wildlife, the fact that the disease is most often mild or subclinical, and the antigenic diversity of the virus all have important implications for control of foot-and-mouth disease. The interaction between SAT-type foot-and-mouth disease viruses, livestock and wildlife in extensive rangeland systems, especially in and around wildlife conservation areas, is complex and also not yet fully understood. In most wildlife areas of southern Africa, there are no fences separating wildlife and livestock. Some countries, on the other hand, have erected thousands of kilometers of fencing to create foot-and-mouth disease-free zones in order to benefit livestock farming. However, even when there are no fences and cattle and buffalo graze together, foot-and-mouth disease transmission from buffalo to cattle often does not occur, and this is sometimes used as an argument against buffalo being a source of infection. It is commonly assumed that transmission of foot-and-mouth disease viruses from buffalo to cattle occurs via contaminated grazing or drinking water. However, while that may sometimes be the case, it is unusual. Cattle and buffalo, like all ruminants, are usually infected by breathing in virus-containing aerosols produced by close-by infected animals, very much like the situation for COVID-19 or influenza in humans. Cattle are more susceptible to infection with foot and mouth disease viruses than other livestock species. However, other wildlife species, impala in particular, are also highly susceptible to infection, although they only sometimes show evidence of disease. Buffalo breeding herds show no signs when they are highly infectious, and no one can accurately predict when breeding herds are likely to be particularly dangerous. When buffalo calves are born, they are not infected with foot and mouth disease viruses, even if the herd is infected. Initially, the colostrum they receive from their mothers in the first few hours after birth protects them against infection for some months. But when the colostral antibodies wane after a few months, buffalo calves soon become infected. The first one probably by an adult carrier in the herd. Once that happens, infected calves rapidly spread the infection to each other. Like children in a creche, during these calfhood epidemics, calves excrete large quantities of SAT viruses for a week or so, although they show no signs of the disease. Most calves in the herd thus become infected more or less simultaneously, and it is during these times that breeding herds of buffalo are potent sources of foot and mouth disease viruses for other susceptible animals, cattle especially, in the vicinity. After a calfhood epidemic in a buffalo herd, the virus disappears from the bodies of about half the individual calves within a month of infection. In the other half, referred to as carriers, the virus persists in the lining of the throat for many months or even years. Infrequently, buffalo carriers transmit SAT viruses to other buffalo with which they are in close contact, and even more rarely to cattle. The mechanism of this transmission is not well understood. However, it is known that transmission from buffalo carriers to cattle requires close contact between the cattle and buffalo for a long period of time, weeks or months. So it is unlikely that single or small groups of stray buffalo carriers transmit foot and mouth disease during brief encounters with cattle. Historically, all outbreaks of SAT-type foot and mouth disease in southern Africa could be traced to buffalo. In recent years, however, there is evidence that some strains of SAT viruses may be adapting to long-term persistence in cattle populations, similar to the situation in East and West Africa, where SAT viruses have been circulating independently of buffalo for many decades. If this is so, it constitutes a new and serious complication for management of foot and mouth disease in extensive rangelands of southern Africa. The foot and mouth disease problem in southern Africa is not country-specific. It is a fundamentally regional problem. Foot and mouth disease disappeared from livestock at about the turn of the 19th century due to the Great African Rinderpest pandemic of 1896. That pandemic not only decimated the cattle population of southern Africa, but also the major maintenance host of SAT-type foot and mouth disease in the region, the Cape buffalo. After the pandemic ended, the buffalo population in the Kruger National Park in South Africa numbered less than 100 animals. Thereafter, their numbers grew almost exponentially, and in 1980, more than 30,000 animals were recorded in the park. The recovery of the buffalo and cattle populations enabled increased frequency of contact between these two species and resulted in the sudden and unexpected reappearance of foot-and-mouth disease in Zimbabwe in 1931. Since then, foot-and-mouth disease and its control measures have had a profound effect on the agricultural economies of African countries. With the exception of Lesotho, foot-and-mouth disease has been reported in all southern African countries since 1931. There was a steady increase in foot-and-mouth disease outbreaks in cattle between 1931 and the late 1970s. However, between about 1980 and 2000, very few outbreaks in cattle occurred. There is reason to believe that this was due to local production and application of improved foot-and-mouth disease vaccines beginning in the late 1970s. Since 2000, however, foot-and-mouth disease outbreaks in cattle have increased remarkably in the SADC region, particularly since 2010. The SADC region experienced 218 outbreaks, 34 events, in the past decade, far more than in any other decade in recorded history. Most events and outbreaks occurred in endemic areas of these countries, where cattle are vaccinated more or less regularly at the livestock-wildlife interface. This provides prima facie evidence that vaccine efficacy declined in the last 20 years. The reasons for this deterioration have not so far been investigated adequately, but are likely to be multifactorial. Lion tete, for example, can never be incorporated into a disease-free zone, as required by the international trade regulations, simply because he lives close to Kruger National Park, where foot-and-mouth disease is endemic in the buffalo. Consequently, he gets far lower prices for his cattle than those in the disease-free zones. These farmers question why their livelihoods are being sacrificed for the sake of wildlife conservation. Southern African countries with large foot-and-mouth disease-free zones, like Botswana and Namibia, are an exception, although their livestock farmers in wildlife areas face the same problem as lion tete. South Africa and Zimbabwe had foot-and-mouth disease-free zones in the past, but have lost international recognition of those zones because of the increasing occurrence of foot-and-mouth disease and spread into foot-and-mouth disease-free zones. Nature-based tourism generates more foreign income for the region than agriculture, forestry, and fisheries combined, and should continue to do so after the COVID pandemic. But the wildlife resource is under threat because of the desire of countries to gain wider access to international beef markets through the creation of foot-and-mouth disease-free zones. Southern Africa, in truth, has little competitive advantage in the international beef market. In the many years over which fencing has been the focus of foot-and-mouth disease control in Southern Africa, it has caused the death of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of wild animals that were cut off from seasonal grazing and water resources. So, the path on which many Southern African countries have embarked is a vicious circle involving ever-increasing costs with diminishing financial return, because prices for beef in European markets are essentially static. The creation and maintenance of foot-and-mouth disease-free zones is enormously costly and environmentally and socio-economically disruptive, with the consequence that no new foot-and-mouth disease-free zones have been established in Southern Africa over many decades. Over the past 20 years, an innovative initiative for wildlife conservation has resulted in the creation of mega conservation areas that stretch across country borders. In order to restore ancient wildlife migration routes in these transfrontier conservation areas, fences between neighboring protected areas are removed. This is, however, in sharp contrast with the use of fences to establish foot-and-mouth disease-free zones. Up to now, the key features of foot-and-mouth disease dictated how countries thought it should be managed. It requires the separation of susceptible livestock from the source of infection, particularly the African buffalo. It also requires surveillance to ensure early detection, as well as vaccination. Yet each of these requirements is now problematic, and therefore requires urgent correction. In theory, the control of SAT serotype foot-and-mouth disease in southern Africa rangelands should be relatively easy because it tends to spread slowly and inefficiently in livestock. On the other hand, because SAT serotype foot-and-mouth disease tends to result in a high proportion of animals with either mild disease or subclinical infection, many such cases are either difficult or impossible to identify by physical inspection of animals, irrespective of how thorough the inspection may be. Therefore, currently, it is impossible to be sure where SAT-type foot-and-mouth disease virus is present. In the protected zones, cattle owners like Lion Tete are obliged to take their cattle to the veterinary dip tank once a week, where officials are to inspect all cattle for any signs of foot-and-mouth disease. But this is unreliable. In South Africa, for example, cattle auctions in previously disease-free zones have recently been identified as a source of foot-and-mouth disease spread. Infected cattle were sometimes transported illegally to auctions in the former foot-and-mouth disease-free zone, where higher prices could be obtained. The difficulty in preventing such activity was primarily due to a lack of an effective cattle identification system, but inability to detect infected cattle that did not show signs of the disease also contributed.
We don't know where they came from, and who in contact they were, and where they came from, exactly where they were born, vaccinated, not vaccinated, anything like. We have no background history of these animals. All we're now looking for is specifically active lesions on the animal. Well, obviously blood tests would be the most accurate, but this is the second best alternative. There is no other alternative because anyone can drive any cow from any part of South Africa and drop it off at any auction house without any papers. And that's where there's no traceability in the country, so this is the next best thing.
The flip side of this problem was commercial buyers purchasing apparently healthy, but in reality infected cattle at auctions, and unknowingly introducing those infected animals onto feedlots with devastating consequences. The fundamental principle is that no infectious disease can be adequately controlled in the absence of accurate and rapid surveillance. Currently in southern Africa, physical inspection is the major surveillance tool, but although rapid, it is insensitive. What can be done about that? A number of serological tests are available for the detection of antibodies to foot-and-mouth disease viruses. There are also serological tests that differentiate between antibodies produced as a result of vaccination from those that arise following natural infection.
Yeah, that here looks better. It looks like we got some small tissue bits there as well. And we also didn't get any contamination with foodstuff, so the pH probably fine. The other materials we could have been taken would have also been some saliva, but we got some tissue. Better, now we're going to bleed as well. Can try to get live virus in the early stages of the disease.
These tests, however, have the disadvantage that they need to be conducted in a laboratory, and therefore there is often a significant delay, sometimes weeks, before the results become available. Therefore, much like the situation for COVID-19, there needs to be a move towards adoption of rapid or pen-side testing systems that provide results in minutes rather than days or weeks. How about vaccination? Foot and mouth disease vaccines are used as a preventative tool and to assist in the management of foot and mouth disease outbreaks.
I pump quite fit.
However, vaccines cannot cure foot and mouth disease. They only prevent it. When the vaccine is injected into cattle, it causes them to produce antibodies against foot and mouth disease virus in the blood that destroy the virus by complex immunological processes. Foot and mouth disease vaccines do not necessarily protect cattle against infection. Vaccination primarily provides protection against development of disease. So even well-vaccinated cattle can become infected, although they should not develop the disease. Furthermore, if vaccinated cattle should become infected, they will likely excrete less virus than diseased animals and be less contagious. An effective vaccination program requires a good quality vaccine, that is, a vaccine that is capable of stimulating effective antibody responses against the virus strains incorporated into it. The viral strains incorporated into the vaccine need to match the viruses in the field. The vaccination program also needs to ensure that the vaccine is properly administered to as close to 100% of the target population as possible. Vaccines used around the world today contain killed or inactivated virus, although new generation vaccines are being developed and tested in pilot projects. Currently available vaccines against SAT-type viruses are, for a number of technical reasons, less effective than those against Eurasian types of foot and mouth disease virus. Lion Tete has for many years complied and presented his cattle with every scheduled vaccination, on average 2 times a year. He and his co-farmers will do anything to prevent an outbreak and have also started to herd their cattle away from wildlife fences. Yet, outbreaks of foot and mouth disease continue to persist. In their area, they had 3 outbreaks in the past 7 years.
6-day-old lesions here. Top of the dental pad, the upper gums, also the tip of the tongue.
With each outbreak, they go into an even tighter trade lockdown, and prices drop even further. When outbreaks occur, farmers are usually further obliged to bring their cattle for additional vaccination rounds. Frequent rounds of routine vaccination are costly and logistically challenging for Southern African governments, in part because all stakeholders have been demotivated by investments that have been yielding poor results. SAT viruses are more diverse than Eurasian types. The range of vaccine strains is limited, and it is also challenging to gain regular access to all cattle in deep rural areas. A recently published study indicates that, based on circulating antibody levels, vaccination of cattle in the protection zones of South Africa failed to induce antibody levels usually associated with protective immune responses. The recommendation for the vaccines currently available in the region is to vaccinate the cattle every 6 months. The main objective of vaccination programs against SAT viruses in Southern Africa rangelands is to generate herd immunity levels of 70% or more. Achievement of that goal needs to be judged on the basis of serology conducted on the vaccinated cattle population. In other words, through what is known as post-vaccination monitoring. If herd immunity levels of 70% or more are achieved, outbreaks of disease should not occur. But due to a variety of factors, post-vaccination monitoring is not often performed. Therefore, actual auditing of vaccination programs is only rarely conducted. That, internationally accepted, is a recipe for disaster. There is also the problem that vaccination campaigns are often based on bringing large numbers of cattle to central dip tanks and inspection races. There is no better way of spreading foot and mouth disease than that. Vaccination may therefore not only be a waste of time, money and effort, but also compound the foot and mouth disease problem. If the status quo persists, it is safe to assume that the foot and mouth disease problem in our region will continue to escalate exponentially. Continued outbreaks will place a massive financial burden on all affected livestock producers and industries in southern Africa. What do we do about this? We need to change the perception that the only or first prize solution depends on the securing of geographical disease-free zones. We need to pursue with urgency a different science-based approach to manage foot and mouth disease in southern Africa, one that could result in a win-win solution for all stakeholders in livestock production and wildlife conservation. Lion Tete has all the makings of becoming a commercial farmer and to escape poverty. He can produce perfectly safe beef, even though he lives in an area where foot and mouth disease is endemic in the buffalo. In our new approach, we should concentrate on the safety of the beef itself and not on the area where it was produced. This approach is known as commodity-based trade. Commodity-based trade requires good farming practices as well as effective surveillance and vaccination. It also requires the slaughter of cattle and processing of beef in abattoirs with guaranteed good hygiene practices to ensure that the final product complies with food safety standards and is free of foot and mouth disease virus. Lion Tete and his co-farmers have, a few years ago already, started with good farming practices. With the help of a program called Herding for Health, they learned how to be compliant with commodity-based trade requirements for the red meat supply process. They practice herd health and have improved carcass quality with efficient records. They are guided by skilled eco-rangers to also be more wildlife-friendly farmers. They're encouraged to herd their cattle away from wildlife fences and do strategic kraling. They are compliant with conservation agreements to benefit and promote wildlife conservation through better livestock management. They are trained to be climate smart and have implemented planned grazing, and they do active rangeland restoration.
With this land management, it's excellent. Because previously, when it comes winter, cattle are dying.
They are now able to understand the market access that commodity-based trade offers them. What they now need is an environment where commodity-based trade is pursued with vigor and energy. An updated guideline on commodity-based trade approaches for managing foot and mouth disease risk in beef in southern Africa is already available and endorsed by SADC. Implementation just requires a flexible approach and good management on the part of producers and veterinary services. Ideally, livestock industries and government veterinary services need to work together to establish appropriate protocols. The COVID-19 pandemic provides us with a window of opportunity. There is now a better understanding of how difficult it is to manage contagious viral diseases with subclinical infections. The animal health world can also exploit the technologies of rapid testing systems and new generation vaccines brought about by COVID-19. An extensive rollout of the Herding for Health program throughout Southern Africa, combined with new generation vaccines and rapid pen-side testing systems, offer a win-win solution for all concerned. It is time to truly take advantage of both our livestock and conservation sectors to support a sustainable future for our people.